The evening had settled into a quiet rhythm, streetlights casting long shadows across the suburban neighborhood. Mrs. Anderson, a dedicated elementary school teacher known for staying late to help struggling students, was driving home after another extended parent-teacher conference. Her silver Honda Civic moved steadily through the familiar streets, her mind already on the stack of papers she needed to grade before morning. The reflection of flashing blue and red lights in her rearview mirror broke through her thoughts. She checked her speedometer. She hadn't been speeding. Years of teaching her students about proper conduct had ingrained in her the importance of staying calm in tense situations. She carefully pulled over to the right, positioning her car under a streetlight for better visibility. Following the procedure she'd always taught her students, she turned on her interior lights, placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen, and took slow, steady breaths. Through her side mirror, she watched as Officer Barrett approached, his hand already resting on his weapon, a detail that made her heart rate quicken despite her composed exterior. The neighborhood was unusually quiet for this time of evening, with only the occasional dog bark breaking the silence. A few porch lights flicked on as curious residents noticed the police lights flooding their windows. Mrs. Anderson remained perfectly still, her teacher's ID badge still hanging around her neck from the conference. License and registration, Officer Barrett barked before he even fully reached her window. His tone was harsh, nothing like the friendly community officers who visited her classroom during Safety Awareness Week. She noticed he hadn't activated his body camera, another detail that sent a wave of unease through her. "Good evening, officer," she responded in the same calm voice she used to diffuse classroom tensions. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" Her question was met with an immediate escalation in his demeanor. I said, "License and registration." His voice rose sharply, echoing down the street. By now, several residents had emerged onto their porches, sensing something wasn't right. Mrs. Anderson reached for her purse with deliberate slowness, narrating her movements just as she'd been taught. "I'm reaching for my purse to get my license," she said clearly, keeping her voice steady despite the growing tension. She had just grasped her wallet when Officer Barrett's next action sent shockwaves through the quiet neighborhood. Without warning, he grabbed the door handle and yanked it open. The sudden action caused Mrs. Anderson to drop her purse, spilling its contents across the car floor. Her phone, which had been sitting in her cup holder, was still connected to her car's Bluetooth, accidentally dialing the last number she called, the school board president she'd just finished meeting with. The atmosphere grew heavier as more neighbors emerged from their homes, phones raised and recording. Among them was the owner of the local grocery store where Mrs. Anderson bought supplies for her students' holiday parties and a retired judge who frequently volunteered at school reading events. They watched in growing alarm as the situation began to spiral out of control. Mrs. Anderson's mind raced through her options, drawing on years of experience in maintaining composure during difficult situations. She remained achingly aware that her every move was being scrutinized, just as she was aware of the growing crowd of witnesses. Her hands never left the steering wheel, even as Officer Barrett's aggressive stance became more threatening. The evening air carried the sound of more approaching sirens, but whether they would bring help or further complications remained to be seen. The red and blue lights continued to paint the scene in alternating colors, creating an almost surreal atmosphere as the next few crucial moments began to unfold. Through her open car door, Mrs. Anderson could hear neighbors making phone calls, their urgent whispers carrying fragments of conversations about excessive force and calling the station. The situation was balancing on a knife's edge, with every second carrying the potential to tip it either way. Officer Barrett's next actions would be remembered by everyone who witnessed them that night. His face twisted with unchecked anger as he reached into the car, completely ignoring proper police procedure. "I said get out," he shouted, his voice cracking with rage. The sound echoed through the previously quiet neighborhood, causing several more porch lights to flick on. Mrs. Anderson's teacher training kicked in, the same instincts she used when dealing with troubled students who acted out from fear or anger. "Officer," she said clearly, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "I am happy to step out of the vehicle, but I'd like to know the reason for this stop." Her phone, still connected to Bluetooth, was picking up every word. The growing crowd of neighbors had formed a loose semicircle around the scene, their phones recording every moment. A young mother who volunteered at Mrs. Anderson's school clutched her phone tightly, tears streaming down her face as she documented the unfolding events. Next to her, the owner of the local hardware store was already on the phone with the police station, his voice trembling with urgency. "You don't get to ask questions." Officer Barrett's face had turned an alarming shade of red. His hand moved to his belt again, causing several gasps from the onlookers. The retired judge who lived 3 doors down stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. "Officer," he called out firmly, "we're all witnessing this." But Officer Barrett seemed beyond reason. In one sudden movement, he grabbed Mrs. Anderson's arm, his grip so tight it would leave bruises that her students would notice days later. She winced but remained composed, her years of handling classroom crises serving her well in this moment of crisis. "I am not resisting," she stated clearly, making sure her voice would be picked up by all the recording devices. "I am complying but requesting to know the reason for this stop." Her words were measured, calm, the same tone she used when talking down a student during a difficult moment. More sirens could be heard in the distance, growing louder. The neighborhood watch coordinator, who had arrived moments earlier, was frantically waving down the approaching police cars. By now, the crowd had grown to include parents of Mrs. Anderson's students, local business owners, and even the pastor from the church where she volunteered teaching summer reading programs. Officer Barrett's grip tightened as he tried to pull her from the car. The crowd surged forward instinctively, their collective concern palpable in the night air. "We're all recording," someone shouted. "The school board president is on the line," called another voice. The situation was reaching a breaking point. Through her car speakers, the voice of the school board president could be heard calling out, having heard everything through the still-connected phone call. The arrival of additional police cars cast new waves of red and blue across the scene, their lights reflecting off the phones raised in witness. What happened next would later be viewed thousands of times on social media. As Officer Barrett made one final attempt to forcefully remove Mrs. Anderson from her car, 2 senior officers rushed forward from their newly arrived vehicles. They had recognized the situation immediately. This wasn't their first encounter with Officer Barrett's behavior. The crowd watched in tense silence as the senior officers approached. One of them, a veteran of 20 years on the force, spoke in a voice that carried authority without aggression. "Stand down, Barrett," he commanded. "Step away from the vehicle immediately." Officer Barrett's grip on Mrs. Anderson's arm loosened, but the rage in his eyes didn't diminish. The second senior officer carefully positioned himself between Barrett and the car door, his body language professional but firm. The crowd collectively held its breath as the moment of truth approached. Mrs. Anderson remained perfectly still, her teacher's ID badge catching the light of dozens of phone flashlights. The entire neighborhood seemed to pause, waiting to see how this would end. The only sounds were the idling of police engines and the soft murmur of concerned voices recording every detail. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife as the senior officers took control of the situation. Every person present knew they were witnessing something significant, a moment when justice would either prevail or fail. The next few minutes would determine which way the scales would tip. The senior officer's arrival marked a turning point in the night's events. The veteran officer, whose badge showed over 20 years of service, spoke again with calm authority. "Officer Barrett, you are relieved of duty for the remainder of this shift. Please return to your vehicle and wait for internal affairs." The crowd watched as Officer Barrett's face cycled through emotions, anger, disbelief, and finally, a flicker of fear as reality set in. His body camera was still off, but dozens of phones had captured every moment of his conduct. The hardware store owner's call to the station had set wheels in motion that couldn't be stopped. The second senior officer, a woman who had helped develop the department's new community outreach program, turned to Mrs. Anderson. Her approach was everything Officer Barrett's hadn't been: professional, respectful, and calm. "Ma'am, are you all right? Would you like medical attention for your arm?" Mrs. Anderson's arm bore red marks from Barrett's grip, but her dignity remained intact. She took a deep breath, her teacher's composure never wavering. "I would like to file a formal complaint," she said clearly, her voice carrying to all the recording devices. "And I would like to understand why I was stopped in the first place." The growing crowd of neighbors had become more than just witnesses. They had become a community united in support. The retired judge stepped forward, his legal pad already filled with notes. "I've documented everything," he announced, "and I'm prepared to testify about what I've witnessed here tonight." Inside Mrs. Anderson's car, her phone was still connected to the school board president, who had heard everything. His voice came through the speakers, professional but filled with controlled anger. "Mrs. Anderson, the board stands behind you. Our legal team is already being notified." More vehicles arrived at the scene, not police cars this time, but local news vans. Someone had tipped off the media, and now cameras much bigger than phones were capturing the aftermath. The senior officers exchanged knowing looks. This incident wouldn't be swept under the rug. The neighborhood watch coordinator, a former military officer, approached with a folder. "We've been keeping records," she said, her voice steady. "Officer Barrett has done this before in our community. We have dates, times, and witness statements." The senior officers accepted the folder, their expressions grim. In his patrol car, Officer Barrett sat alone, his face illuminated by flashing lights. Through the windshield, he watched as community members gathered around Mrs. Anderson, offering support and sharing their contact information as witnesses. His power over the situation had evaporated like morning dew under a harsh sun. The local grocery store owner arrived with bottles of water for everyone. As he handed them out, he spoke quietly to the senior officers about the security cameras at his store that had captured similar behavior from Barrett in the past. Each piece of evidence was another nail in the coffin of Barrett's career. Mrs. Anderson stood surrounded by support, her phone now filled with messages from parents of her students, fellow teachers, and community leaders. The school board president had arrived in person, his presence sending a clear message about the seriousness of the situation. The internal affairs officers arrived within 20 minutes, their expressions serious as they surveyed the scene. They found a community mobilized, evidence collected, and witnesses organized. The retired judge had already drafted a preliminary statement, which many community members were signing. Local business owners shared security footage from their cameras that showed Mrs. Anderson's driving before the stop, footage that would prove there had been no traffic violation to justify Officer Barrett's actions. The hardware store's cameras had captured the entire incident from multiple angles. The woman officer who had helped develop the community outreach program spoke quietly with Mrs. Anderson about next steps. "This is why we need good people to speak up," she said, gesturing to the gathered crowd. "Change happens when communities stand together." As internal affairs led Officer Barrett away to their vehicle, the contrast couldn't have been clearer. Where he had tried to use fear and intimidation, the community had responded with unity and proper procedure. His attempt to abuse power had only served to demonstrate the power of an organized community. The night air was still filled with tension, but it was different now, the tension of anticipation rather than fear. Everyone present knew they had witnessed not just an incident, but a turning point. This wasn't just about one traffic stop gone wrong. It was about a community saying enough to abuse of power. As news of the incident spread through social media and local news channels, the community's response grew even stronger. Within an hour of the traffic stop, the elementary school's parent group chat was buzzing with activity. Parents who had witnessed their children's beloved teacher being mistreated were already organizing. "Remember when she bought school supplies for the whole class with her own money?" one parent said to the gathering crowd. "Or when she stayed late every day for 2 weeks to help my daughter catch up after she was sick," added another. Each person had a story about Mrs. Anderson's kindness and dedication to their community. The city council member who lived in the neighborhood arrived, still wearing his pajamas under his coat. He had been watching a movie with his family when the texts started flooding in. His presence added another layer of official oversight to the situation, and he immediately began coordinating with the senior officers. Local business owners continued arriving at the scene, each adding their own perspective to the growing documentation. The coffee shop owner, where Mrs. Anderson bought morning treats for her students, spoke up about Officer Barrett's previous aggressive behavior toward other customers. The dry cleaner mentioned how Barrett had harassed several other community members in recent months. Inside the school board president's hastily convened emergency meeting, conducted via video call on someone's laptop at the scene, decisions were being made. the board unanimously voted to provide full legal support to Mrs. Anderson. They recognized that supporting her meant supporting every teacher's right to drive home from work without fear. The media presence had grown, with reporters interviewing witnesses and community members. Each person spoke about Mrs. Anderson's role in the community, how she volunteered at the summer reading program, organized food drives during holidays, and always made time to attend her students' extracurricular activities. The retired judge, who had been taking statements from witnesses, noticed something important. "Look at the pattern," he said to the internal affairs officers. "Every incident reported about Officer Barrett shows the same escalation of aggression without cause." His legal pad was now filled with times, dates, and witness names. The Neighborhood Watch coordinator pulled up a digital map on her tablet showing the locations of previous incidents involving Officer Barrett. The pattern was clear. He had been targeting certain areas of the community, thinking no one was keeping track. But they had been meticulously documenting every occurrence. Parents of Mrs. Anderson's current and former students created an online support group right there on the street, using their phones to coordinate future actions. They planned to attend the next city council meeting en masse. Some were already designing T-shirts with messages of support for their children's favorite teacher. The local church pastor, who worked with Mrs. Anderson on community outreach programs, began organizing a prayer vigil for the following evening. But this wasn't just about prayer, it was about showing unified community support. He coordinated with other religious leaders in the area, turning it into an interfaith gathering. The owner of the local print shop offered to make posters for free. The grocery store owner promised to provide refreshments for community meetings. The hardware store owner offered his parking lot as a gathering space for future organizing efforts. Each business owner found a way to contribute to the cause. Mrs. Anderson, still maintaining her professional composure, spoke quietly with the internal affairs officers. Her words were measured and clear as she detailed not just this incident, but other times she had witnessed Officer Barrett's behavior toward community members. Her statement would become a cornerstone of the investigation. The senior female officer who had helped defuse the situation earlier pulled up the department's new community policing guidelines on her tablet. "This is exactly why we implemented these changes," she explained to the gathered crowd. But clearly, some officers haven't embraced them. The contrast between her professional behavior and Barrett's actions couldn't have been clearer. As midnight approached, the crowd didn't thin. Instead, more people arrived, bringing coffee and snacks for those giving statements. The community had transformed a potential tragedy into a moment of unity. Every phone that had recorded the incident was now being used to plan future actions and coordinate support. The local news crews captured something powerful that night, not just an incident of police misconduct, but a community's immediate and organized response. Their cameras showed people from all walks of life working together, supporting a teacher who had touched countless lives and standing up against abuse of power. The next morning, the police chief called an emergency press conference. Standing before a room packed with reporters and community members, his expression was stern and determined. "What happened last night is not what our department stands for," he declared. "We've reviewed the footage from multiple sources and immediate action has been taken." Mrs. Anderson sat in the front row, surrounded by fellow teachers and school board members. The bruises on her arm were visible now, documented by hospital photos from her visit to the emergency room last night. But it was her dignified presence, not her injuries, that commanded attention. The police chief continued, detailing the immediate suspension of Officer Barrett without pay. The announcement drew murmurs from the crowd, but it was his next statement that caused the room to fall silent. "We've uncovered a pattern of similar incidents," he revealed. "Internal Affairs has opened a full investigation, and we're reviewing every interaction Officer Barrett has had with our community." In the audience, the retired judge nodded approvingly. The folder he'd helped compile, thick with witness statements and documented incidents, sat on the table in front of the chief. The community's meticulous record-keeping was proving invaluable to the investigation. The school superintendent stepped up to the podium next. "Our teachers deserve to feel safe in our community," she stated firmly. "Mrs. Anderson has shaped young minds in our district for over a decade. Her dedication to our children is exemplary, and the support she's receiving shows exactly why she's such a valued member of our community." Outside the press conference, students and parents gathered with handmade signs supporting their beloved teacher. One child held up a poster covered in heartfelt messages from her entire class. The local news cameras captured these touching displays of support, showing how one incident had united an entire community. The city council member who had witnessed the incident announced new measures being proposed. "We're drafting legislation to require immediate activation of body cameras during all stops," he explained, "and we're implementing additional oversight measures to ensure accountability." The hardware store owner's security footage played on screens behind the speakers, showing clearly that Mrs. Anderson's driving had been perfect, no traffic violations, no erratic behavior, nothing to justify the stop. The police chief watched the footage with a clenched jaw, his commitment to reform evident in his expression. Internal affairs officers provided updates on their investigation. They had discovered that Officer Barrett had disabled his body camera multiple times during similar incidents. This pattern of behavior, combined with community documentation, painted a disturbing picture of abuse of power. The local civil rights organization's representative spoke about turning this incident into lasting change. "We're working with the police department to revise training procedures," she announced. "This isn't just about one officer or one incident, it's about ensuring our entire system protects and serves everyone equally." Mrs. Anderson's union representative announced their full support for legal action. "We stand behind our teachers," she declared. "Every educator should be able to focus on teaching our children without fear of harassment or discrimination. We're providing full legal resources to ensure justice is served." The police department's community liaison officer outlined new initiatives for building trust. "We're expanding our community policing programs," she explained. "This includes regular meetings with neighborhood groups, increased transparency in our procedures, and better channels for reporting concerns." In the crowd, the Neighborhood Watch coordinator sat with her tablet, adding new information to their community database. What had started as informal documentation of concerning incidents was evolving into a formal system for tracking police interactions with community members. Parents in attendance shared stories of how Mrs. Anderson had impacted their children's lives. "She makes every student feel valued," one mother testified. "That's the kind of person she is, always thinking of others, always working to make our community better. She didn't deserve this, but her response to it shows exactly why we all respect her so much." The press conference concluded with the police chief's commitment to systemic change. "This incident has shown us where we need to improve," he acknowledged. "We're grateful to the community members who documented these concerns, and we're committed to earning back your trust through concrete actions, not just words." The days following the incident brought waves of change through the community. Officer Barrett's personnel file had been opened for review, revealing a history of complaints that had previously been overlooked. The internal affairs investigation uncovered a pattern that could no longer be ignored. Local businesses began posting community safe space signs in their windows, an initiative started by the coffee shop owner where Mrs. Anderson bought her morning coffee. "If anyone feels unsafe or harassed," she explained to reporters, "they can come into any business with this sign. We'll help them contact proper authorities and serve as witnesses." The school board's emergency meeting drew unprecedented attendance. Parents, teachers, and community members packed the auditorium, spilling into the hallways. Mrs. Anderson's calm strength as she addressed the board touched everyone present. "This isn't just about me," she said. "It's about making sure every member of our community feels safe and respected." At the elementary school, students showed their support in touching ways. The art teacher helped them create a massive wall mural celebrating community heroes, teachers, responsible police officers, and community leaders who made a positive difference. Mrs. Anderson's portrait, painted with careful detail by her students, held a central place. The police department's internal review expanded beyond Officer Barrett. "We're examining every complaint filed in the past 5 years," announced the police chief. "Any pattern of misconduct will be addressed. We're committed to rebuilding trust through actions, not just promises." Community organizations that had previously worked independently began joining forces. The Neighborhood Watch Group shared their documentation methods with other communities. The retired judge helped develop a citizen's guide to properly recording and reporting police interactions. Mrs. Anderson's story reached national news outlets, but not for the reasons Officer Barrett might have expected. Instead of focusing on the confrontation, they highlighted the community's response, how people came together, how they used proper channels to seek justice, and how they turned a negative incident into positive change. The hardware store owner installed additional security cameras covering the street where the incident occurred, donating the footage feed to a community oversight committee. Other business owners followed suit, creating a network of accountability that extended throughout the neighborhood. Support for Mrs. Anderson took practical forms. When she mentioned feeling anxious about driving home late after parent conferences, a group of local business owners worked out a schedule. Now someone would always be outside their shop, watching out for their community members during late hours. The school superintendent announced new policies protecting staff. "We're providing legal resources and support services to all our employees," she declared. "And we're working with the police department to ensure our teachers feel safe traveling to and from school, regardless of the hour." Officer Barrett's disciplinary hearing approached, but the community's focus wasn't on punishment, it was on prevention. The local civil rights organization worked with police leadership to develop new training programs. "We want to stop these incidents before they happen," explained the organization's director. The Parent-Teacher Association organized workshops on knowing your rights and proper interaction with law enforcement. These sessions, led by legal experts and community leaders, drew large crowds. "Knowledge is power," the retired judge explained. "When we know our rights and proper procedures, we're better equipped to protect ourselves and each other." Mrs. Anderson's classroom became a symbol of community resilience. Students started a kindness project inspired by their teacher's composure during the incident. They wrote letters to community helpers, made thank you cards for responsible police officers, and learned about peaceful conflict resolution. The local news continued following the story, but their focus shifted to the positive changes emerging from the incident. They covered the new community safety initiatives, interviewed business owners about their support programs, and highlighted the strengthening bonds between neighbors. As the investigation progressed, more community members came forward with their experiences. Each story was carefully documented, building a comprehensive picture that would help prevent similar incidents in the future. The retired judge's legal pad had grown into a digital database accessible to proper authorities and community leaders. 1 month after the incident, the community gathered in the elementary school auditorium for a town hall meeting. The room was packed with faces that had been present that night: the hardware store owner, the retired judge, parents, teachers, and dozens of community members who had stood together in support of Mrs. Anderson. The police chief stood at the podium, his expression determined as he delivered the news everyone had been waiting for. "After a thorough investigation, Officer Barrett has been permanently removed from the force," he announced. "But more importantly, we're implementing sweeping changes to prevent similar incidents in the future." Those changes were already visible. Every police car now had dashboard cameras that activated automatically when lights were turned on. Body cameras couldn't be manually disabled. The department had established a civilian oversight committee, with the retired judge serving as one of its founding members. Mrs. Anderson's influence had grown far beyond her classroom. She had helped establish a community education program, teaching people about their rights and proper procedures during police encounters. "Knowledge removes fear," she would say, using her teacher's gift for making complex information clear and understandable. The Neighborhood Watch Coordinator presented their new community safety app, developed with help from local tech professionals. It allowed residents to document and report incidents, connect with witnesses, and access legal resources. The hardware store owner had helped fund its development. Stories of positive change kept emerging. A young officer, inspired by the community's response, had started a program bringing police and students together for monthly basketball games. The coffee shop owner hosted regular community conversations where residents and officers could talk openly about concerns and solutions. The school board had transformed their support of Mrs. Anderson into lasting policy changes. Every school now had clear procedures for supporting staff who experienced harassment or discrimination. The superintendent proudly announced that their district was becoming a model for others across the state. Local businesses continued their Community Safe Space program, with the idea spreading to neighboring towns. The grocery store owner shared how just last week, a scared teenager had come in seeking help, and thanks to their training, they knew exactly how to assist. Mrs. Anderson's students had learned powerful lessons about standing up for what's right. Their kindness project had grown into a permanent part of the school curriculum. When something bad happens, one student explained to a news reporter, "We can either get mad or make things better." Mrs. Anderson taught us to make things better. The retired judge's documentation system had been adopted by the police department itself, creating unprecedented transparency in tracking officer behavior. "This isn't about punishment," he explained. "It's about identifying problems early and addressing them before they escalate." The City Council passed new legislation requiring regular community feedback sessions with law enforcement. The council member who had witnessed the original incident made sure these weren't just formalities. They were meaningful discussions that led to real changes. Mrs. Anderson's classroom walls now featured a new poster, "Be the change you want to see." Below it hung photos of community members working together, business owners at their shops, officers playing basketball with kids, neighbors helping neighbors. It was a daily reminder of how far they'd come. The final report on Officer Barrett's conduct revealed dozens of previous incidents that had gone unaddressed. But more importantly, it showed how systematic changes could prevent future abuses. The police chief used it as a teaching tool in their reformed training program. 1 year after the incident, the community gathered again, this time for a celebration. They weren't just celebrating the changes they'd achieved, they were celebrating their unity, their resilience, and their commitment to making their community better for everyone. Mrs. Anderson stood before the crowd, her quiet strength touching everyone present. "Sometimes it takes a difficult moment to bring out the best in people," she said. "What matters isn't what happened that night. What matters is what we chose to do about it together."